Thank you for tuning in to watch this. Again, this is being published because we are unable to meet as the Benton Harbor congregation during the time of this shutdown for the coronavirus. And yet we want to still center our lives around spiritual things. So I greatly appreciate you tuning in. In our first lesson, we talked about elevate, rising above the sufferings of this world. And we set forth the truth from 2 Corinthians 4, verse 17, that our light affliction, our suffering here in this world is light and momentary. Our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us, produces for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Our suffering is light and momentary when compared with the eternal glory, the weight of glory that we will receive someday in heaven. Today we're looking at lesson number 2, still under the heading of rising above suffering. Elevate, rising above suffering. And we want to look at the story of Job. He certainly was someone who suffered. And there is much that we can learn from Job, but there is even more that we can learn from the story of Job, because there were some things that Job himself did not know. And that's really the subtitle of this lesson, what Job did not know. First, we need to understand the story of Job, and we need to understand the backstory, what it was that was going on behind the scenes. Let's start with this fact, because this is pretty much where the book starts. Job was a righteous man. He was a good man. He is described as perfect and upright. Now, that word perfect is not the idea of being sinless. It is the idea of being blameless. It is the idea that he was mature in his spiritual nature, and he was doing his best. He was perfect and upright. He feared God, it says, and he eschewed evil. He drew back or recoiled from evil. He tried to avoid evil. He is described in this way for us, so there can be no doubt of the kind of person he was. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he was rich. In fact, with all of the livestock that he had, all of these things, he was called the greatest man in the East. Chapter 1 and verse 3, which is the idea that he was the richest man around. And Job was spiritual. He offered sacrifices to God for his children in case they had done something wrong. Chapter 1 and verse 5. And Job was such a good man that God, at one point, actually twice, called the attention of Satan to Job. Have you seen my servant Job? And Satan hates righteousness. Satan determined that he was going to bring Job down. He wanted to drag or propel or lure or buffet Job into sinning. He made the claim before God that Job was only righteous because God had sheltered him, protected him, and given him all of these blessings and made him rich. He declared that if the blessings were removed, if the protection was removed, Job would curse God, chapter 1 and verse 11. So God put all of the things that Job had and owned under the control or the authority of Satan, and allowed Satan to exercise his power over those things. Satan brought enemies, the Sabaeans and the Chaldeans, who destroyed or stole all of Job's livestock. And suddenly, in one day, Job went from being the richest man in the East to being one of the poorest men around. And in that same day, Satan used a great wind to kill all 10 of Job's children. And Job's response shows some of the greatest faith ever exhibited. In chapter 1, verses 20, 21, and 22, Job says, "Then Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down on the ground and worshipped. And he said, 'Naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord.'" And verse 22, "In all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly." What faith! What strength! What integrity! It is no wonder that he is described as such a righteous man. In chapter 2, God pointed out to Satan that Job had retained his integrity even when he lost all of these riches and blessings. In spite of his loss, in spite of his grief, he retained his integrity. Chapter 2 and verse 3. So Satan again attacked Job's character. He claimed that if Job's health were taken away, then Job would curse God. Chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. So God gave Satan permission to attack Job's person, but not to kill him. Chapter 2 and verse 6. And then in verses 7 and 8, Satan struck Job with boils all over his body, from the crown of his head to the sole of his feet. And this was more than Job's wife could take. And she said to him, "Do you still retain your integrity? Curse God and die." And listen to Job's response in chapter 2 and verse 10. "Thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of the Lord? And shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. There are some great and comforting truths here that we need to stop for a minute and just take note of, because they will help us when we face problems. Satan is not omniscient. He doesn't know everything. He thought that Job's integrity and righteousness were bound up in things. He was wrong. Satan could not see the future. He could not see into Job's heart. Now, Satan is smart. He is devious. He is dangerous. He has devices to destroy us. 2 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 11. But Satan doesn't know everything. Our God knows everything. Our God knew what Job was going to do. But Satan did not. Another great comforting truth here is that Satan is not omnipotent. He could only do what God allowed him to do. God set the limits. God drew the line, said this far and no farther. And that's still true today. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. "There hath no temptation or trial taken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, that will not suffer you to be tempted above that ye are able, but will, with the temptation, make a way to escape, that you may be able to bear it." These are wonderful, comforting things for all of those who want to live godly in Christ Jesus. Satan is not omniscient. Satan is not omnipotent. He has limits, and our God is in control. Before we begin to look at the things that Job did not know and to learn lessons from them, let's look at what Job knew. First, Job knew the power of God. Study this in chapter 26 when he talks about the things that God with his power had done. It's a very powerful passage. And secondly, Job knew that he had done his best to live righteous before God. Study chapter 31 as Job described his life, how he made a covenant with his eyes that he should not look on a maid, how he helped the poor, how he never was tempted by idolatry and those things. He was a righteous man, and he knew it. He was such a righteous man that God mentioned him to Satan. Now, Job didn't know that part. But Job knew this, that regardless of what happened, he was going to continue to live a righteous life. as long as he drew breath. In Job 13 and verse 15, Job said, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. In Job 27, verses 2 through 6, listen to these powerful words. As God liveth, who hath taken away my judgment, and the Almighty who hath vexed my soul, all the while my breath is in me, and the Spirit of God is in my nostrils. My lips shall not speak wickedness, nor my tongue utter deceit. God forbid that I should justify you. Till I die, I will not remove mine integrity from me. My righteousness I hold fast and will not let it go. My heart shall not reproach me so long as I live. These things were not empty bragging. This was a commitment, not a boast. Job was determined, as long as he lived in this world, whatever his circumstances were, he was going to do what he knew to be right. And he would not give that up, no matter what. You see, one of the things that Job knew was that someday he would see God. It seems that Job believed in a bodily resurrection. Job 19, beginning in verse 23, Job says, oh, that my words were now written. Oh, that they were printed in a book, that they were graven with an iron pen and lead in the rock forever. Verse 25, for I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand on the latter day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and mine eyes shall behold and not another, though my reins be consumed within me. Job was determined to do what was righteous. And he knew that he would be vindicated someday. That's probably the meaning of the word Redeemer here, that he would be vindicated for his righteous life. But I believe that Job's example is more compelling, more elevating, if we want to think of it that way, when we realize the things that he did not know, and yet he continued to do that which is right. You see, Job didn't know the backstory here. Job didn't know what had happened in the spiritual realm that unleashed these terrible things in his life. He did not seem to know that Satan was the one at work behind all of this. You see, in Job chapter 1, he attributes his great losses, his riches and his children being taken away from him, he attributes that to God. The Lord giveth, or the Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In chapter 2, he says that he and his wife were receiving evil, that is the idea of calamity or affliction or grief or loss, that they were receiving that at the hand of the Lord. Now, some would argue that these were just figures of speech, that Job was saying it that way because he knew God allowed this. Possibly. But remember Job's friends. They came to comfort him, supposedly. And Job says himself they were miserable comforters, Job 16 and verse 2. They knew even less about this situation than Job did. They spent much of the book in long speeches trying to convince Job that God was punishing him for some evil doing. And of course, Job denied their accusations. He was a righteous man. He knew he was a righteous man. He defends his righteousness, but never does he say, oh no, it's not God doing this, it's Satan doing this. Never once does he say that. Job did not seem to know this spiritual backstory. And even more clearly, Job did not know that he was suffering because of his righteousness. He knew he was not suffering for his evil. He knew he was not being punished by God. And this is an important thing for us to keep in mind, brothers and sisters. When we suffer something, it's not necessarily an indication that we're being punished by God. Certainly we can suffer in this life because of things that we've done wrong. We can have cirrhosis of the liver because of our drinking. We can have lung cancer because of our smoking. We can have a broken family because we have behaved in ways to alienate people and to break that family. But the simple fact that we are suffering does not mean that God is punishing us. It certainly didn't mean that in Job's case. In Job's case, the truth was he was suffering because he was righteous, and he doesn't seem to understand that. He doesn't seem to know that. We know it from hindsight. We know it looking back. His friends accused him of evil doing. He defended his own righteousness. But he doesn't know that Satan is using him as a pawn, that Satan was trying to prove he was not truly a righteous man. Sometimes righteous people suffer not for the sin they have committed, but because they are righteous. Satan gave Paul a thorn in the flesh to buffet him, 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 7. We talked about that in the first lesson about overcoming suffering, rising above suffering. Satan uses his followers to attack the righteous. He hopes to shake our faith, to bring us down. Of course, Satan is going to attack those that are righteous. He doesn't want righteousness to succeed. And Satan continues to be active in our world. 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8, he is walking about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Job did not know the plans that God had for him. He didn't know that God was going to restore all of his riches and more besides. He didn't know that he was going to have 10 more children. In the midst of his grief and loss, these terrible afflictions that he was going through, he didn't know that the end of the Lord was full of pity and tender mercy, as James talks about it in James chapter 5. And if you read the book carefully, Job does not know why God allowed him to suffer as he did. Read it. God never explains it to him. God tells him, you are not in a position to question me. And he condemns his friends for being wrong in the things that they have said to Job about Almighty God. But God does not answer to man. He doesn't defend what is going on here. He doesn't explain what is going on. When we face tragedy, when we face affliction and grief and loss, we may not know the exact reason. That doesn't mean we can't trust in God. That doesn't mean we can't continue to be righteous before him, as Job continued to be righteous before him, even though he did not know why he was suffering. Now, this is an area where we know more than Job did. We know, in hindsight, the purpose of God, or at least some part of it. What we know about it may be a grain of sand on the beach to the whole picture, but God has given us the insight of the written word here to tell us the backstory and to help us understand why God allowed Job to suffer, and we can gain valuable truth from this. We know at least a part of the reason that God allowed Job to suffer. And we can gain from that the faith that God does not allow us to suffer in vain. God has a purpose. We can elevate our thinking about this and elevate ourselves above the suffering when we understand that God uses suffering to produce something good, something wonderful. Well, what was productive about the suffering of Job? Where would you be without Job? Where would I be without Job, without this story? In James chapter 5, James, the brother of Jesus, sets forth Job as an example of suffering and endurance. And he says we need that same kind of patience or endurance when we face suffering. In his case, Job's suffering is set forth to prove that the Lord is pitiful and of tender mercy. James chapter 5. To remind us that we should not grow weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not. In due season the reward is coming. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 9. How many people through the centuries have been comforted by this story of Job, knowing that there was good in the end for this great man? How many people in the midst of distress have not been in despair because they had the example of Job in front of them, because they could be comforted by his story? How many people have held on to righteousness because of the example of Job? Satan wanted to make an example of Job as a sinful man and bring him down. And God wanted to make an example of Job to elevate him so that we can look at him and follow his example and be like he was. Job is an example of a rich man who had set his affections on things above and not on things of the earth. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 2. And the question for us is, will we follow his example and be elevated to a higher plane, elevated above the sufferings of this world? Thank you for tuning in.